The title of my talk is The Printing Press, Fake News, and the Wars of Religion, Why Regulation is Necessary for Free Speech. Liberal democratic regimes typically hold free speech to be sacrosanct. The paradigmatic justification for such freedom was laid out by John Stuart Mill. What is not always noted by those who draw on Mill is that he does not defend the freedom of all speech, but the liberty of thought and discussion. There's a difference. Discussion is not mere speech, but regulated speech that requires not only vocalization, but mutual exchange, speaking and listening, treating your opponent not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a discussion partner who can help move our thinking towards the truth. Such speech has a real utility for both the individual and the community. While Mill defends true, half-true, and untrue speech, he assumes that everyone involved in the discussion listens to their interlocutors and seeks the truth. Speech that deserves protection is thus speech that aims at this end and not at character assassination, lies, disinformation, efforts to groundlessly spread fear and alarm the public, to undermine legitimate authority, to defraud, libel, defame, or slander. Freedom of speech and debate thus requires not just a soapbox and a megaphone to outshout all others, but a forum in which ideas can be exchanged, tested, theses asserted, defended, or revised. The end of such an exchange is not victory or profit, but progress towards the truth. Speech that is not directed toward that end, that aims instead at power and victory, or merely at destroying one's opponent, is not justified by Mill's argument. What even Mill fails to take into account is that what we take to be free speech is always only free within a unique social world that is shaped by particular modes of communication. After all, freedom of the press only makes sense when one has a press, just as freedom of speech depends upon us having a common language. A discussion that takes place in a single room, governed by Robert's Rules of Order, is quite different than an unmoderated online back and forth between anonymous posters, trolls, and bots. Language not only facilitates the search for truth, but also makes it possible to deceive, exploit, defraud, enrage, mislead, and manipulate one's listeners. Language thus can be used for good or ill. The free use of language is then only justified when the good it produces exceeds all the ill it brings about. All societies struggle to distinguish truth from falsehood and determine whether any particular speech act aims at a general good or only at the good of a speaker, his family, friends, party, or corporation. Making such a determination can be quite difficult. Fortunately, humans over time have for the most part eventually been able to determine who is more likely to be telling the truth and concerned with the general good, as opposed to the deceiver and grifter concerned only with his own wealth and power, to distinguish information from disinformation and genuine criticism from ad hominem attacks. The key word here is eventually. Every expansion of the means of communication inevitably involves a transformation in the nature of the forum in which speech takes place. This transformation makes possible not merely new means of transmitting and receiving knowledge, but also new means of deception and disinformation. Indeed, such changes often overpower existing frameworks and leave civilizations looking for new methods of distinguishing fact from fiction. Such breakdowns are not merely imaginary. In fact, the danger of individuals and states being overwhelmed by the proliferation of new means of communicating are very real. While these new technologies are often extraordinarily useful, they inevitably also become weapons for those seeking to overturn the existing order and increase their own wealth, stature, and power. To defend themselves from such attacks, both individuals and states must regulate the interchange among individuals and moderate the flows of information. New methods of regulation, however, also open up new possibilities for increasing the power of regulators. How then can we promote free speech that aims at the truth without also giving license to new forms of deception or promoting tyranny? Or to use contemporary examples, how can we find a path between the Great Chinese Firewall and the unpoliced and increasingly anarchic cacophony of X? We are currently in the midst of a tremendous transformation of the means of communication. With the advent of the new media, we have opened up new venues for both transmitting and distorting information, for incredible cooperation and massive manipulation. As a result, we are being overrun by images, sounds, and text in multiple forms and venues. Moreover, one of the effects of the transformation has been an astonishing increase in the number of those participating in these fora, including experts seeking to enlighten the public, young adults looking for love, curious children, trolls more dangerous than in any fairy tale, conspiracy theorists, agents of various and often malicious states and political movements, religious fanatics spewing vitriol, corporations trying to convince us that our lives will not be worth living unless we purchase their wares, and nihilists who just want to burn everything down. All too often in the world opened up by the new media, free speech and discussion, as Mill understood them, are overwhelmed by partisan forces less interested in truth than in spreading disinformation everywhere. In this talk, I will seek to ferret out, I will not seek to ferret out all of the sources of disinformation and distortion that we confront. Many with much greater knowledge of the field have already done so. Moreover, the development of this new technology is so rapid that the dangers it poses outruns our attempts to define and delimit them. Instead, I will examine a similar earlier transformation, the invention of the printing press, and the disastrous consequences that followed in its wake, and then turn to a brief discussion of the problems we face today and some suggestions drawn from the earlier example about how we may come to ameliorate them. The printing press. There's little doubt, as Hannah Arendt suggested, that without the printing press, modern civilization would have been impossible. It is thus hard to deny its immense value for human life. However, in praising its long-term consequences, in praising the long-term consequences of printing, we should not overlook the incredible short-term costs it entailed. As the transformation in communication wrought by the printing press accelerated, it increasingly challenged and ultimately undermined the two traditional sources of authority, the Catholic Church and the state. I do not mean to assert that such questioning was unwarranted or that we would have been better without it, but rather to suggest that some greater awareness of how the printing press undermined the structured order of human life may give us some insight into the dangers we face today. After all, while the printing press made modernity possible, it also contributed to the wars of religion and the deaths of between 8 and 16 million Europeans. Although woodblock printing was practiced in China in the 11th century and movable metal type was used in Korea in the 14th century, printing in these societies was difficult and expensive because of the large set of characters that were needed. Due to the limited set of alphabetic letters, Gutenberg's printing press was much easier and less expensive to use, and this, of course, is a picture of that. The process made communication of information more widely and rapidly available. When we think of printing, we are prone to think of books. We're scholars and students, after all. This is no accident. The most famous book ever printed was the first, Gutenberg's Bible. As a business venture, however, his printing shop was a failure. He didn't even sell all of the first 180 copies of the Bible. The difficulties were many, including the small size of the Latin reading public, the difficulty in shipping books, and the absence of shops where books could be purchased. The growth in printing thus crucially depended upon the development of a market for printed material. For the first 100 years or so, the goal of most printers was not to produce classics, but to sell enough to stay afloat. What they printed was thus less important than that they printed and made a profit. Their products were often not books. This may seem strange to us at first, but it should not. We have a thriving book industry, but books actually play only a small part in the printing world. A variety of other products, including posters, pamphlets, handbooks, brochures, newspapers, magazines, labels, bank statements, government documents, catalogs, postcards, stamps, etc., vastly outstrip books as the bread and butter of the industry. Books may or may not sell and are costly to distribute. Other forms of print are both more certain and more easily distributed. One need look no further than Gutenberg himself, who, after failing to sell his Bibles, printed pamphlets, calendars, and other ephemera, in an effort to make ends meet. Unsuccessful. That is not to say that in the early printing industry, books were neglected. Before the invention of the printing press, manuscript books could be counted in the thousands. But by 1500, less than half a century later, that number had increased to 9 million. Among the greatest beneficiaries of this new means of communication were the Renaissance humanists, and particularly Erasmus, whose works and editions and translations made him the most famous private man in Europe. At one point in the before the outbreak of the Reformation, almost a quarter of the books in print were either edited or printed by him, something I'm certain no one will ever match in the future. It is thus not surprising that he had a positive view of the prospects and value of printing. As he told the Pope in the spring of 1517, he was convinced that the new letters, as he called it, would make possible a new golden age. His hopes, however, were soon dashed when in the fall of that same year, an obscure German monk published a broadsheet that undermined the authority of the church and state that had ordered Europe for the previous millennium. That man, of course, was Martin Luther. Luther's 95 Theses was not the first, but it was certainly the most important example of a broadsheet, and probably the most important sheet of paper ever printed. This medium of communication quickly became the principal means of informing, misinforming, motivating, and manipulating the general European public for the next 200 years. A broadsheet was a single page that ranged in size from 13 by 13 inches to 16 to 60 inches. Slightly longer material, such as pamphlets, had a similar importance. These products were cheaply printed, easily transported, and often posted in places where people could see them. This might seem surprising, since only 1 in 3 men and 1 in 10 women could read at the time. Many, if not most, of the broadsheets, however, were adorned with images to illuminate the message in the article for those who could not read, and it was common practice for those who were literate to read the broadsheets aloud in taverns and other public places for the benefit of their illiterate companions. The early broadsheets were generally quite accurate and informative. They often provided news of extraordinary events, including accounts of battles, royal births and deaths, strange events in the heavens, and accounts of wondrous creatures. They were produced irregularly and were clearly printed to sell, not to disrupt prevailing authority. Luther's 95 Theses changed all of that and ushered in what is known as a pamphlet war. Instead of presenting a simple account of events, the succeeding broadsheets became the principal vehicles of propaganda and fake news that helped to stoke the partisan religious passions at the heart of the wars of religion. The printing press thus proved to be as much an agent of death and destruction as of progress. There were many events that demonstrate this point. The earliest examples was the affair of the placards, and this is an image of one of that original placard, in which anti-Catholic posters appeared in Paris, Blois, Rouen, Tours, and Orléans during an October night in 1534. One was even posted on the bedchamber door of King Francis I. Enraged and shaken, the king abandoned his attempt to protect Protestants and gave in to those who sought to crush the Reformation. What had been an acrimonious debate thus quickly turned deadly, leading, not only killing many people, but leading many Protestant leaders, including Calvin, to flee for their lives. The war of words, however, continued. On January 13th, shortly after the king returned to Paris, broadsheets calling into question the status of the sacraments appeared throughout the city. And this was only the beginning. The pamphlet war continued unabated in support of the Reformation on one side and in support of Catholicism on the other, and that was almost impossible to stop. The king's actions were emblematic of the first efforts to deal with the problem posed by the new technology, and their failure was repeated time and time again. Nor was this merely a political problem. The Catholic Church faced similar difficulties. For the previous 1,000 years, the highest source of authority, the Word of God, had been a monopoly in the hands of the Catholic Church, since few laymen and women could read Latin or even understand the priest's words in the Mass. Christianity, for the most part, was thus an orthopraxis religion run by a priestly guild with monopolistic control of the means of salvation. The printing press and the Reformation changed all that. The Word of God was no longer available only to the priesthood, but translated into the vernacular became available to the masses. The church's monopoly was thus seriously threatened. Christians no longer needed to rely upon priests to tell them what was right and wrong, but could listen to God himself. The church initially sought to stem this tide by prohibiting both the translation and reading of the Bible. The reaction of many laymen and women to the prohibition was predictable, although not to the people at the time. Given the choice of listening to priests speaking in a language they could not understand or listening to God himself in their native tongue, the decision for many was obvious. As a result, the Reformation spread widely and was beyond the control of the Catholic Church at the time. The Catholic Church was thus forced to abandon the effort, and following the leadership of Loyola and the Jesuits, adopted a much more successful policy, encouraging the laity to read the Bible, but teaching them to read it in the right way, relying on education instead of coercion. The Church, however, did not completely abandon its efforts to prohibit the reading of religious texts, but focused not on the Bible, but on texts they believed could lead good Catholics astray, establishing the index of prohibited books that limited what they could read, an index that still exists, by the way. Creating a list of prohibited books was one thing, actually keeping them out of the hands of the motivated readers was another. Catholic authors thus took up pens in defense of their religion, both defending their own doctrines and attacking Protestant beliefs and behavior, employing the same exaggerations and deceptions as their opponents. The growing vitriol of the pamphlet war led to ever-increasing partisanship and demonization of opponents. Reports of atrocities, some real, some exaggerated, some simply false, were rampant. A great deal of what passed for truth was fake news, but it played an ever larger role because it was so effective at mobilizing core supporters. And of course, pamphlet production remained very lucrative for both Catholic and Protestant printers. In this way, political, theological, and economic incentives combined to foster and intensify animosity. These efforts to persuade Catholics to eschew reform, however, were not enough. More coercive measures were necessary. Consequently, those who abandoned Catholicism were condemned as heretics, and if they would not recant, handed over to the state for execution. These efforts were directed and carried out by the Inquisition, especially in Spain and Italy. Many Catholics whose orthodoxy was called into question were thus forced to flee to avoid persecution. Since one of the core tenets of the Reformation was salvation by faith alone, Protestants were less willing to force conversion, but constantly worried about backsliding. They were convinced the Pope was the Antichrist and that his army of Jesuits was using satanic methods to subvert Protestantism. They thus kept a wary eye on their fellow congregants and condemned those such as the Armenians and the High Church Anglicans who retained some of the Catholic practices and beliefs, arguing that these churches needed to be purified. With so much partisanship, mistrust, and disinformation and intrigue, it is not surprising that wars broke out all over Europe. The most important were the Peasants' War in Germany, the French Wars of Religion, the 80 Years' War, the 30 Years' War, and the English Civil War, and the Glorious Revolution. These wars, however, were not merely concerned with religion, but also with state consolidation. But their vehemence owed more to the Manichaean sense on both sides that they were involved in a struggle of good and evil. While all of these wars were horrific, the 30 Years' War was certainly the most devastating, claiming 30% of the German population and 50% of Bohemian population. Moreover, the Catholic conquest and destruction of Magdeburg, including the murders of 25,000 men, women, and children, quickly became Europe's first great media event. With innumerable broadsheets and pamphlets describing its horrors. This is an example of one that you can find, even to this day, you can find hundreds of them. All of this publicity hardened sectarian lines, and the war, which had raged for 13 years, continued unabated for another 17. One could easily produce similar accounts of events in Holland and England. What is eminently clear is the difficulty everyone faced in trying to distinguish truth and falsehood in the context of new means of communication. Printing made possible an enormous increase in the spread of knowledge, but also opened the door for those who disagreed with the prevailing order or simply wanted to vent their spleen and sow chaos. As a result, the political and religious authorities struggled to sustain their authority. They were reluctant at first to take decisive measures, seeking instead to control not the means of communication, but the manner in which they were used. When that failed, they sought to convince people to use these means of communication in ways that supported their vision of the truth. When that too proved ineffective, they sought to ban materials inimical to their authority. All of these efforts, however, failed and served only to magnify the partisanship and ultimately led to internecine war. How a renewed sense of truth and authority was established is a longer story that I can only sketch here. The most important element was the development of a notion of sovereignty that united control of the church and state. Theoretically, this was spelled out by Baudin and Hobbes. Practically, it was achieved by the sectarian states in the Treaty of Westphalia, the English Bill of Rights, which banned people who were Catholics and Unitarians, and through the elimination of the Huguenots and the establishment of absolutism in France. Such sovereignty also helped to fix the meaning of terms and thus to combat the equivocations and distortions at the heart of the pamphlet war. This was established in Hobbesian fashion by the sovereign assertion of the meaning of words through institutions such as the French Academy. Such an absolutist solution, of course, did not work everywhere. More successful in the long run was the path sketched out by Locke in his method of organizing commonplace books that became the foundation for dictionaries and encyclopedias that proliferated during the Enlightenment. This provided the grounds for the development of modern science, rooted in a new Lockean epistemology that distinguished logical and empirical truth from fantasy and revelation. The sovereign states were also able to establish laws that reigned in the print media. They gave permission to publish to specific printers and granted copyright. While this could not prevent the printing of materials in secret or shipping them in from abroad, it did give printers incentives to self-police in order to prevent others from dipping into their profits, while at the same time holding the printers accountable for libelous and anti-government publication. In the long run, sovereignty also helped to expand and secure the market for printed materials. Many printers were moved by partisan passions, but they had to be more concerned with making profit. The path to economic stability for them lay in a different direction that was essentially to provide regular and accurate news. The idea behind this almost certainly arose from the little recognized publication in Venice of what were called avisti, or gazettes. During the years of the pamphlet war, when fake news was dominant, the avisti were a unique, largely trustworthy source of information. They were handwritten and sold at a very high price to a very specific trans-European clientele, stockbrokers and investors who really cared about what was going on, who needed accurate information to estimate risk. Begun in 1566, these sheets were circulated broadly by sailors moving from port to port. The profit that they commanded did not pass printers by. The first proto-newspapers were printed in Germany in the last decades of the 16th century, and by 1650, trustworthy newspapers began to appear across all of Europe. They were a stable source of income for printers, and while often censored by states in which they appeared, they generally reported foreign news and prices accurately. In fact, their continued success depended upon accuracy. Financial incentives drove them to hew closer to the truth, although they were never bereft of sensationalism. The similarities of this period to our own are all too clear. As in the case of the printing press, the internet has vastly increased our ability to communicate. This has had a number of extraordinary and quite beneficial consequences. It has made the dream of the Enlightenment an actuality by putting most of human knowledge at the fingertips of anyone who has a cell phone. For those of you who grew up in an age after the cell phone was invented, this is just astonishing to people who were born earlier. It has made easier to communicate with family and friends. It has produced a global economy that benefits everyone, although clearly some way more than others. It has facilitated the rapid transmission of scientific information. While we have gained a great deal from the internet, it has also disrupted our established notions of orderly speech and thus undermined our collective sense of truth and authority. It has also enabled the owners of the means of mass communication to manipulate the masses in new and unprecedented ways. Just as the church and European states initially failed to regulate and delimit printing, states today failed to regulate the internet, and particularly the great internet platforms. Thus, in both cases, disruptions in orderly communication were the result of the state's failure to assert sovereignty. In the case of the wars of religion, this had a great deal to do with the absence of a clear notion of sovereignty. In our case, it was due to the belief that government regulation was, in almost all cases, an impediment to progress. Regulation was also more difficult with respect to the internet because it was designed for defense purposes as a distributed network. And as such, it would be safe from foreign attack. In any case, the corporations that ran the internet and allowed it to operate in any case, the corporations that ran the internet were allowed to operate in a laissez-faire manner. The Chinese have demonstrated, however, that the internet can be constrained, although only by severely limiting the benefits that free exchange of information makes possible. It was the fear of such constraints that led the FCC to eschew all limitations on internet speech. This was not unreasonable in the context of the time, since there were good reasons to imagine that free flows of information would strengthen liberalism and promote global peace and commerce. As a result, internet platforms were exempted from the legal restrictions that had long been imposed on all other forms of communication, and particularly from claims of liability for falsehoods and libels that appeared on their sites. This extraordinary and ultimately catastrophic grant of freedom was due to the original classification of many online platforms as pipes rather than as publishers. This more like a telephone service than a newspaper. This exemption was embodied in the famous or infamous FCC Section 230. There have repeatedly been calls to reverse this decision, but the platforms have actively lobbied against this and funded candidates from both parties to convince them to reject any constraints, arguing that they are still pipes despite continually mounting evidence to the contrary. To put it in more familiar terms, they argue they are like a telephone company that simply delivers messages from one point to another. While this claim is plausible for email providers, platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok have become something much more, applying algorithms not to simply edit or modify texts, they're careful not to do that, but simply picking the best and most engaging of hundreds, if not thousands or millions of similar variants to promote. And what they promote, of course, are the most things that are likely to attract the most readers, the things that are most outrageous. Thus, platforms used a number of tools to act as meta-editorial organizations to increase engagement and extension, and by extension, their ad revenue. They thus effectively have become publishers for anyone who did want to publish, and for many who did not, including those who did not want their views to appear in a public forum, but who were tricked by the deceptive use of the term sharing and a default setting to give access to the whole world. The platforms have clearly followed this path without exercising traditional direct editorial control in an attempt to dodge being treated as publishers, and thus liability for whatever libelous, defamatory, or scandalous words or images appear on their sites. In promoting some content over others, however, they do act as editors. They thus should be held responsible for their actions. To a limited extent, they have tried to check facts to limit attacks by trolls and other malicious actors, and to ascertain whether the users are actually human beings or just bots. These are difficult problems, but these platforms have solved many other more difficult problems before. It thus seems likely that the real reason this struggle continually fails is because platforms have a tremendous economic incentive not to remove inflammatory content, since it is precisely that content that is known to drive engagement. Here the similarities to the early printing industry are manifest. The recent privatization of Twitter and the decision to disband the fact-checking team strongly suggests that fact-checking is not only difficult but unprofitable and therefore unwanted. More eyes on more engaging posts generates more revenues, even if many of these posts are by terrorist organizations, malicious foreign governments, and other disinformation organizations. The second failure was in allowing the platform to collect what is effectively psychometric data on users. Though the platforms have gone to extreme lengths to obscure this and called their efforts by a variety of seemingly benign names, i.e. cookies. Who doesn't want cookies? They also hide the grant for them to collect such data in lengthy terms of service that they know very few individuals will read. Moreover, when they do ask for permission, they disguise what they are doing by asserting that their goal is to improve the individual's experience on their sites without providing any obvious way to opt out. These permissions are then used as carte blanche to collect data on users to better target information at them that will likely keep them reading the site for longer periods of time. The technological means of achieving this tracking and targeting are unimaginably various, and recent attempts to regulate the ironically named cookies have been akin to trying to prevent murder by outlawing knives. Further, the use of tracking data to maximize engagement had a pernicious and at times addictive effect, especially on children. And to top it off, platforms not only used the psychometric data to run their own sites, but also sold access to that data to other sites to help them better exploit their markets. This could and perhaps should have been controlled by classifying this psychometric data as subject to HIPAA regulations, as all medical information is, requiring extensive safeguards on sharing and penalties for breaches, as well as the explicit consent of users in its collection and the terms of reuse and sale beyond any terms of service. Here the FCC, accepting a libertarian notion of freedom of speech and pointing to the incredible advantages of the dissemination of information, did not and perhaps could not have recognized these consequences and the need for regulation to avoid all of the problems that have since come to light. This transformation of these platforms since the initial rulings suggests the crying need for a reconsideration of the rules ordering these platforms of communication. There are obviously free speech concerns with any attempt to regulate the information space. The great Chinese firewall is a looming danger that is increasingly being adopted in one form or another by authoritarian regimes to silence opposition to government policy and action. You don't only have to look at China or Russia, you could look at what happened to the Arab Spring and the way that was crushed in Egypt. That said, in seeking to preserve free speech, we should not give in to the nihilistic chaos of X, nor should we allow ourselves and our children to be manipulated by algorithms based on psychometric data that has been gleaned by the platform spy bots. One might imagine that these failures to deal with these real dangers could easily be remedied by government action. But in contrast to authoritarian regimes such as China, democratic regimes have to deal with the immense power that flows from the political contributions by those who own and profit these practices. That said, there are some lessons that we can learn, it seems to me, from the earlier modern disruption in the forms of communication as a result of the turn to printing that may help us consider ways to reorder the similar situation we face today. Printing too undermined the sovereignty, or what might better be called in that time the authority of both church and state within their respective realms. Broadsheets, pamphlets, and even books could be printed and moved with relative impunity. With the proliferation of printing, finding ways to prevent mis- and disinformation, libels, and ad hominem attacks thus became very difficult, even for authoritarian regimes and religious institutions that had very little interest in free speech. The problem for printers, as we discussed above, was profitability. As a result, they were willing to print almost anything. As we have discussed, governments ultimately granted printers copyright privileges that helped their bottom line and gave them financial incentives to police their own industry, while at the same time giving them incentives to exercise editorial control over the authors to avoid liability claims. In contrast to 17th and 18th century printers, however, internet platforms are already extraordinarily profitable and become ever more profitable by attracting increasing numbers of users and keeping them engaged for greater lengths of time. It is thus unlikely that any financial incentives government would be willing to offer to have them police their own content and reject fake news could match the profits they are making from publishing such news, since it is precisely the most inflammatory posts that attract the most users. In all likelihood, governments will thus need to rely upon either direct restrictions or on economic disincentives. These might take a variety of forms. Perhaps the simplest would be granting them tax deductions for investing more in editorial control, combined with the threat of much more intrusive government regulation, treating them as monopolies that need to be broken up. And they are effectively monopolies. One could imagine that this might induce better performance. Alternatively, simply subjecting them to the same rules that we subject publishers to would be effective, although very expensive for the platforms to implement. Perhaps the easiest way to achieve this would be for the FCC to reconsider Section 230 and agree that internet platforms can be held liable for mis- and disinformation, libels, character assassination, etc. This would require them to put in place editorial reviewers like those publishers employ all the times for any posts that are shared with the public. It is also not impossible that AI could be used to do some of this work. Internet platforms should also be prohibited from collecting personal search data and creating psychometric profiles of individual users. And you can see from this diagram exactly how that takes place. Prohibiting collection and use of such data without individuals' explicit consent would also help to restore some more individual privacy and reduce their manipulative efforts. Whether these changes would ultimately be successful, of course, is difficult to determine. These measures are not new and are clearly justified by legal precedent. Whether they are politically feasible, of course, we can only guess, especially since much of our current political life and debate occurs on the very platforms that need to be better regulated. That said, we are desperately in need of better regulation to revivify what Mill called the liberty of thought and discussion, so essential to democracy. Without that, democratic political life will degenerate into partisan warfare. In order for humans to be the beings they are, they must not just scream at one another, but communicate. That said, all speech and communication occurs within technologically shaped spaces and make orderly conversation possible. The disruption and distortion of the fora within which we speak will thus necessarily change who we understand ourselves to be, both as individuals and as a society. While such disruptions from time to time affect all regimes, they are especially trenchant for democracies because of the greater importance of communication to reaching consensus. Thus, while the new forms of communication have come into being with the internet hold immense promise for a democratic future, this promise can only be realized if we develop new rules of order that make it possible to speak and hear one another without the interposition of trolls, bots, foreign agents, and other sources of mis- and disinformation. Whether democracy can survive thus depends upon finding a means of navigation that will allow us to sail safely on these open but very treacherous seas. Thank you very much. Questions? Mm-hmm. Lisa.
Thank you very much, Michael. So I have a question, probably like more institutional. So what about your point on regulation? Because I usually think that if we had more regulation in general in businesses or for platforms like social media or for newspapers, usually the costs of entering their business would raise. So I don't know if there are usually small businesses cannot catch up with all the regulation in the energy sector, and therefore we will end up just having like few providers of news or whatever. So I'm not sure whether democracy would benefit from more regulation, because if we just have fewer providers can just ally with just a part of the public opinion or the government or one part of business. What do you think about this?
Well, when AT&T controlled almost all of the telephone communication in the United States, people made a very similar argument, right? If you break it up, there'll be just these small companies that won't be, well, when it was broken up, it turned out that the costs of making telephone calls plummeted, right? So I'm not convinced that it's going to become more expensive if those platforms are broken up, number one. Number two, yes, it will be more expensive for them to exercise editorial control, but we've imposed those rules on all other forms of communication, right? If I in my next book, whoever publishes it, if I put something in there maligning someone, they and I can be sued. So we've given these internet platforms a special status within the communication world. So I think just holding them to our existing legal constraints would make it. Now, yes, it would be expensive for them to do this, but they've dealt with lots of expensive things before and found solutions to it. And it's not clear that there are not technical solutions to this that involve AI. So I'm not as pessimistic about the possibility of doing it. I'm more pessimistic about the political will to do it in our current environment.
Thank you, Professor Gillespie. So I know with Microsoft, they had an antitrust case, I think in the 90s, and essentially they were accused of being a monopoly because when you defined the market that they were monopolizing as an operating system with an internet browser bundled, then their market share was like 90% or something. Now, if you use a different definition of the market that you were referencing in terms of monopolization, and you exclusively talked about internet browsers, then I think their market share was like 20%, it was like less than 50. It was radically, radically smaller, and it was not reasonable to call it a monopolization. How do you look at potential monopolies in this market and ensure that the definition's not arbitrary? Because I know, like, in just kind of like the realm of economics, you have catalactics, which is to say there are essentially like infinite product. It's like there's every product on the market. Every product on the market is competing with every other one. So you get a lot of arbitrary definitions of which market is being monopolized. So just how would you approach that here?
It certainly is the case that most of the great internet platforms have bought up all of their competitors whenever they could, right? Whenever they were allowed to do that, right? So that's not so that that's just a typical behavior. That they don't want competition, and but I think that's just the giving them more maybe making them more competitive with one another should be used as a threat. I actually think that the internet platforms that we have, if they are required to act like other publishers, can be put under more controls that will benefit communication, right? Lots of people are concerned when we bring a speaker in who they don't like politically. They'll come and shout them down, right? And everybody recognizes that that's antagonistic to the notion of free speech, right? And yet, if you put something online about take any current event that's controversial, Israel versus Hamas, Ukraine versus Russia, there'll be thousands of posts that will come, especially at least if you're of any importance at all, thousands of posts that will come to shout you down and fill up the information space. So this is a broad and universal problem. So if you're trying to speak, being able to speak freely doesn't just mean having a place to stand and shout. If there are 100,000 people shouting at the same time you're not going to be heard, right? So that's what Robert's Rules of Order were developed in order to make it possible to conduct conversations that gave people a capacity to speak and be heard. And that's what it seems to me would be very useful for many of these for communication in our current internet world. Mm-hmm.
So I guess we've sort of about a couple of different things to be regulated. Right? I've heard fake news, I've heard getting shouted down, false misleading narratives, and the regulatory strategies get much more complex the further you stray from, I think in like October 2016, we were worried about like the Macedonian teenagers like just literally making stuff up, right? And that was our original perception of like truly fake news. But from a social media platform perspective, like someone quote tweeting a dunk on someone who fires off a take is a lot harder to capture, right? It's not like you post a URL from a suspect domain when you do that, and then in the empirical space, I think that a vast majority of the really truly false, misleading information or claims on truth value come from political parties, political candidates, right? Like what is January 6th, but not a very widely distributed false, misleading narrative from a major political party. And so I'm not.
How did that party become that party?
How did the Republican Party become the MAGA Party?
Well, I guess this is kind of my point, though, is that the regulatory challenge gets more complex as you.
Oh, the regulatory challenge is way more complex than I laid out. There's no question about that. But the argument for regulation seems to me to be pretty persuasive. If you believe in free speech, if you believe in not shouting people down and letting people speak, and making sure that the people that are speaking are actually people, as opposed to bots who are organized by foreign governments, whomever, political, revolutionary parties, I think that then you can have a conversation. But the fact that you get shouted down by supposed people that are really bots is another thing.
So I guess I need to resolve this to a question, right?
Mm-hmm.
My question is, so setting aside the question of like who decides what or what not, gets scrubbed from the internet, how do you decide what it is to be regulated?
Oh, yes, that's should you regulate emails? If I send an email out to 20 friends, right? Should that be regulated? Do I have to and I say something, I don't know, that Trump lies, right? All the time. Suppose I say that now, and somebody says you're maligning Trump. Okay. As long as I've sent it out to friends that I know. But Facebook is a good example. How many friends? Do you know how many friends you can have on Facebook?
5,000.
5,000. I have just about 5,000, right? And which when I stopped using Facebook, about 5,000. I don't have 5,000 friends. These are people that are directed to me to list me as a friend by a program that's manipulating them because they know that I'm saying things they want to hear, right? And that's the psychometric side of the equation. That the same thing happens. That same thing happened with the Tea Party movement to start with. That became the MAGA movement. People get directed towards things they want to hear. So we don't really have a discussion anymore. We just live in echo chambers where people hear back and forth. That's the importance of the psychometric data. Right? Now, it's been extraordinarily valuable for the people that own these things. I mean, they've produced as I was walking over here, I think I was telling people, I saw 90% of I kept walking over from Gross Hall, 90% of people were on their cell phones, right? It's a beautiful day. Look at the sky, look at the trees. No, it is an addictive behavior that's been transformed by the way in which the media platforms and their algorithms have shaped things. Anyway, Thor?
You've mentioned the psychometric data and the algorithm as part of the problem, that it's targeting people towards posts that are more controversial. But you also mentioned that a problem is the echo chamber where you're listening to the same views over and over. So I was wondering if you thought that there would be a regulatory solution to structuring the algorithm so that people encounter views that are different from their own but are framed in a constructive way, or if that goal is just out of reach.
Well, I prefer that we don't structure any conversation. We don't have any regulators structuring conversations. I would prefer there just be conversations, right? So yes, you could get people to hear contradictory information, but if you got them to hear, this is what I used to call the Nightline phenomena, which is a show that disappeared before some of you were born, where they had this idea that, it arose during the Iran hostage crisis, and they would bring in every day somebody who was extreme on the left and extreme on the right, and they would scream at each other, right? And that was what they thought of as balanced news, as opposed to somebody in the middle who could give you an analysis of all of this. So, I think that's another way to engage the public, right? It is, think of Crossfire, all these other shows that came into existence where people just scream at each other or argue. It isn't informative. It's just like watching people fight, right? So I'm not so sure. If people want to do that, that's fine. But I don't think we ought to be, put that as a requirement for making things better. I think in the long run, I know today, to come back to my Avisi, right? There are stock market, there's information brochures that come only in printed form that are never put online, that are sold to people that sell stocks, right? Why? Because they actually need accurate information. They need to know what's going on. There are people that, should you invest in China, right? Well, the Chinese thing, they recognize they don't have probably more than 1.4 billion people, but all of the other studies of how much light they produce, of salt consumption, show that their population is below 1 billion, right? So that's makes a huge difference if you take that data and off of the internet, or even from IMF, which just accepts their data and publishes it, republishes it, as opposed to knowing what really is going on. So people that want to know what's really going on are willing to pay for it. Now, one of the things that we all like about the internet is it's free, right? We don't want to pay for things, right? So we accept, but it's not free, right? It's free because they're making money on you in another way, right? So it might be better, if you think about it in that sense, to have some paid sources where you can actually get accurate news. Mm-hmm.
So you talked about instituting sort of an editorial board for these platforms to restart the fact checking that places like Twitter sort of stopped doing. But how do you, because that's assuming that fact checking and these editorial boards are truly apolitical and objective, which feels difficult to achieve in 2024. Maybe you can get close to it, but you're just hiring people, and people have biases that will influence how they approach the job. So how would you standardize that so that you're not filtering out, you're not fact checking with a bias that just tends towards the people who comprise the editorial vote?
Well, some things are easily fact checked, right? Did Biden say this, right? You can see whether it was true or not, right? I mean, that's not a hard thing to do, right? Newspapers do it all the time. So is it going to be somewhat biased one way or another? Yes, but but simply false things. And if any of you read Google News, they usually have a little box that says false things that are true or false, right? And that makes a big difference in terms of thinking about, in terms of how you accept that information. The one I saw today was a post by a congressman from, I'm going to forget, Republican congressman from somewhere, with a picture of the Baltimore Bridge saying, "This is what DEI gives you," right? I mean, it's just crazy. So those things, there's no reason for those things to be, to not just have a label underneath them that says crazy or something to that effect. Yes, there will be some. You're not going to escape from partisanship, but the partisanship probably, if people have some reasonably accurate information, won't be as absurd as it is now. Mm-hmm.
Key part to a bunch of your answers, and also the early solution, is that there was a constituency of people who really saw this as valuable, and so there was the market response to serve that need, and people really cared to tell the difference. And there still exists today lots of places where people care enormously about the veracity of what they're getting. But there's also a bunch of nonsense in print, and a bunch of nonsense on the airwaves, and a bunch of nonsense. Like, it's not like we have clean information everywhere else and just chaos.
That's right.
Part of it's a demand issue, is people want to be lied to. Or people want to be told what they want to be told.
People look, as a species, we are much more likely to respond to threats than, there's no newspaper in the world that says, the headline of which is, "It's a beautiful day today," right? It's a beautiful day today, but no, it doesn't. Nobody's going to publish that because I can see that. But if it's a beautiful day today, but the ozone amounts in the air are so terrible, you should go do X, Y, Z. We're concerned about our own preservation and well-being, so we always respond to what seems dangerous to us, right? Good example: fear of crime. Fear of crime in Britain from 1840 to 1890 went like this. The actual existence of crime in Britain went like this because of the invention of Scotland Yard, right? But it sold. All those stories in the Strand, sold, and the solution for them was Sherlock Holmes, right? We've got this brilliant detective that can solve this problem. For us, it's CSI, right? They're all of these things. So when the Duke lacrosse scandal happens, people are waiting for they think like, okay, tomorrow we'll have the DNA data. No, it was a long time to get DNA data because, well, but on CSI they get it the next day. Well, that is the way the world works. So, but it's a kind of, we have imaginary solutions for imaginary diseases, and that helps, but that's not, and to come back to your good question, 2 of my students work for Facebook fact-checking, right? Both of them were really quite brilliant. They were both AB scholars here at Duke, and they got fired after about a year. Number one, because the whole operation was costing Facebook too much, and they were disallowing too many things, right? I mean, one was a Democrat, one was a Republican. So it was, Facebook was, I mean, at least in that respect, they were trying to be somewhat balanced.
Anyway.
Yeah, I guess with respect to the antitrust, I wonder if your argument that these social media companies and platforms aren't simply pipes, which seems intuitively correct, doesn't sort of beg the question, or not beg the question, philosophically, raise a question about how this sort of antitrust work. Like, if you break up AT&T, I don't actually care how the pipes work, right? I don't care that I'm on Verizon and my mother's on AT&T, as long as I get connected, right? Whereas, if I'm posting on a social media platform, I have a vested interest in as many people seeing that as possible. So like, as a consumer, I have a vested interest in there being monopolies in social media.
Well, you don't necessarily, I mean,
Like, how do we divide up the
to be honest, one proposal at one point was people should get paid according, and this happens with people that are internet influencers, right? They get paid for the number of people that view their content, right? But we don't do that. Why? Because what content is the most viewed? It's the most salacious. It's you didn't hear me say this, but in class once I said, puppies and kittens are the second most viewed thing on the internet. And one of my students said, what's number one? And there were lots of peals of laughter, right? Because it's pornography. I mean, it is, you didn't hear that, okay? But that's, I mean, it's a good thing that people don't think about that, but and why should we pay people that produce pornography more for being on the internet, right? But they get paid for that, right? I mean, so it's a source of income. For a long time on Facebook, I kept getting friend requests from beautiful women from various parts of the world, okay? Okay, I understand, that somehow my charms, exceed, are better than my age, et cetera, et cetera. But, of course, this is the way prostitutes started started advertising on the internet. So I'm okay with prostitutes advertising and with sex workers getting paid for their work, et cetera, et cetera. But, you just have to recognize because that's relatively nonviolent, right? There are plenty of violent things on the internet too. I mean, and violent inducing things. Anyway.
So one of the things that you mentioned kind of in passing at the beginning of your talk was how, of course, the success of the printing press was dependent on the printers having an audience, right? And so one of the important things that the printing press, of course, encourages in Europe is the formation of these linguistic, literary areas of public discourse, because very quickly they realized that, actually if we print in the vernacular, that's just so much more conducive to us. So the printing press is really closely linked to the emergence of what we might call national communities. So as a consequence of that, after the wars of religion, a lot of the original consensus surrounding free speech and publication rights and all of this emerges in these relatively small areas, national communities or something analogous to this, right? And so it happens against a particular cultural backdrop. of what we want and what we don't want, or kind of expectations about what we think is appropriate conduct and what discourse, whatever, publications. But it seems like the problem of regulating internet, of course, reaches vastly beyond any of these traditional boundaries. And I wonder to what extent that completely undermines, or perhaps undermines, but in many ways gravely complicates the project, because we don't have this kind of consensus in the background as to what does our cultural community consider to be appropriate conduct and appropriate content.
Absolutely. No, I agree entirely with that. But that's why we have the equivalent of pamphlet wars on the internet, right? It stretches across national boundaries. I mean, the idea, think about this, the idea during the Cold War that we would have allowed Russians to assume American names and write articles that got published in American newspapers. That did happen, right? It did happen, but it was pretty strictly. I mean, we worked very hard to keep that to a minimum, right?
Were they good arguments?
Well, you know, we had a secretary of the Treasury Department that was, you know, working with Stalinist agents. So yeah, some of them were quite good. Alistair McIntyre told me at one point they were publishing things. They knew that the magazines were funded by the Comintern, and
Well, the Cantor was funded by the CIA.
they were published on both sides. But that was kept. I mean, but those were kept at a kind of minimum and under control.
I did want to ask one question. How difficult it is to find a false thing. I just today reading an article in the New York Times about Israel, an anti-Israel article, and the article said Israel turned down proposals for two states repeatedly. 2 days ago, I read another article that said the opposite. It was the Palestinians who spent that forth. I don't know what the truth is, but that's a very difficult one. An easy one is somebody who proposes that the Earth is flat, flattened. That's obviously false.
Well, he played for Duke basketball. Now, come on.
On the other hand, you wouldn't want to delete it. It's a harmless falsehood. So it's impossible to work that properly. I just don't seriously review it.
Well, it may seem like there's no solution to it, but there are solutions to it. It's just whether there's a political will to follow up those solutions. Just look, China does not allow TikTok to run in its country, right? But they argue that we're violating free speech if we try to force TikTok to be sold to American owners. Why? Because they're using it for gleaning data. Right? So there are lots of, there are just lots of examples of that. But we're running out of time. So I'm happy to stay and talk to people if they want to come to questions, but thank you all for coming.